we're going to do a quick, big kind of painterly, washy background. I've got a big cup of water, and I've got a wash brush. I'm going to coat the paper with water so that I have a big, soft canvas to blur paint into. I'm going to use watercolor to do this, and I'm going to just put a thin membrane of water, so I'm not drenching it. I'm just putting like a little thin coat on it. So I've got a thin coat of water. If I had my full kit, I would probably start with a spray bottle with a really watered down mixture of probably a warm or a rosy tone. So I might start out with something like a soft rose or maybe a yellow ochre and something like that, and I would probably start by spraying the whole thing so that there was a really diffused and dispersed and soft color wash in the background, and let that kind of soak out into the paper. In terms of making a background for a costume sketch, so whatever you choose to do with one sketch, you basically want to use the same background formula for that entire series of show sketches so that they all live like in the same world. And backgrounds are a thing where having ombres of color or irregular gradations of color are advantageous. So it's better to have something where the colors are not really clearly defined, or where they just blur and blend into each other. If you do something that's super painterly and strokey, that's fine as well. Some people will use like big scribbles of markers and things like that also. So, but generally you just want it to kind of be obscured shapes and tones of colors. So I've blended in a kind of a green, a blue, and a soft pink here into my background. I'm going to switch now to a different brush, a round brush, albeit a fat brush. If I had my full kit, I would prefer to use like a big bamboo calligraphy brush to do this, but I don't have all of my things. So I'm gonna go into a slightly deeper blue. Now I'm just gonna kind of lay in some different clouds and patches of color. Depending on the orientation of the sketch, you might place something like this differently. It's often good to have a sort of an asymmetrical or a diagonal placement that you can then place the figure into. Most of the time, if you do a background, it's advantageous to lay out the background first and prep all of your papers and all of your sheets that you're going to place your sketches onto. Prep them all first, that way you can let them dry, and then you can draw and paint the figures on top of them. So that would be preferable to doing a background after the fact. After the fact, if you mess up the background, you've messed up your whole sketch. So once you become more confident or have a specific background style that you like, then maybe you can whip it out and put it onto the sketch once the figure's in place. So I'm going to drop in a bunch of water because, again, if I had a spray bottle, that would be preferable. But backgrounds are also a place where you can mess around with things like what I'm doing right now, where you drop in paint and let it disperse. You can also play with marbling type things. So I'll show you. This is pretty wet at this point, so I can train the paint and create different shapes and washes and blends, right? And I can move like the clouds of depth of color into different places as well. So right now, actually, I have more of a concentration of color in the middle of the page, which would probably be good because that's probably where I'm going to have my figure placed. And I somewhat accidentally also have more of a concentration of cool colors here. So let's say I've painted it in the landscape direction. But let's say I turn it to portrait, I actually would have more of a wash of color that kind of lands down at the bottom. Let's say we have something that has a portrait layout and the figure would be arranged vertically here. Let's move forward now that way. Once the figure's in place, it often works out kind of nicely to have something where there's a dark shadow cloud on one side, particularly like in this case, if you were to say have the light direction coming from over here on the figure, that would mean you'd have the highlight side or edge of the garment and the skin over here and the shadow side over there. So that would give you already like a contrast, right? So the simplest backgrounds, if you do choose to go the painterly route, are most effective when there are sort of murky, cloudy color shapes or color like auras. And sometimes what will also be pretty effective using real paper and real paint is that the paint kind of buckles. And so sometimes that creates like valleys and recessions where the paint is liquefied and wet, and the places that that paint kind of congeals becomes darker and more intense with color, so you get what looks like purposeful kind of modeled color placement. So right now the pink is settling in here, the blue is settling in here, and we're going to end up with sort of shadow pools. I'm going to now switch to a flat brush and try to place more direct pigment onto it, right? So this is actually something that those of you who've ever had a scenic painting class also do, right? This is how you finish a scenic painting usually, is by spattering it in 2 or 3 different tones that were used to create the painting. So it's not really a high tech process, it's a messy process. So it's one that has a backsplash. So watch what you're wearing and definitely cover your area that you're working in, right? So, but that's another way that you can create a little bit of implied texture that will break up the colors, add a little bit of interest in the background and all of those things. I'm now gonna go into a darker blue and dilute my brush a little bit and similarly spatter. So we could keep going on with additional layers of this. If we don't like it, we can mute it, blot it down, or anything like that. But I think you get the idea. And at this point, we would have to let it dry. And of course, we would have to do this to all of the other sketches. So I think you can already see the pros and cons of backgrounds. Let's try applying a background to a finished sketch. On this one, let's try just doing shadow pools to her side and at her feet. I'm going to use a big round brush so I can move around her figure without disturbing the underlying painting, and I'm going to try to move quickly. I reached storage capacity on my camera while I was painting this, but I didn't realize. So you're looking at the finished product and the brush that I used to do it. So I used a gray-violet mixture, starting at the head and building up saturation and value towards the bottom. I built a kind of cloudy shadow around her figure, and then worked my way down, as you can see, and really in just a few brush strokes had given her a little bit of cast shadow and cloudy background. We'd already given her some linear background, so this just puts a little bit more color on the page. And now I'm going to just do a quick kind of enhancement of the horizon line, and that's about it.